everyone, and happy International Archaeology Month. Yesterday, the Archaeological Institute of America Nashville Society and the Parthenon celebrated International Archaeology Day here at the Parthenon, reaching over 1,300 people in total. I want to thank yesterday's partners, including today's speaker, Dr. Debby Sneed, as well as Reed's Goldleaf, the Metro Historical Commission, and Kidsville for their great work yesterday. And shout out our education team, Helen, Katie, and Paris, for organizing such special public programming. Two quick upcoming things to highlight. Continuing this collaboration with the Parthenon and Archaeological Institute of America Nashville Society, we have a book club on Monday, November 3rd. All are welcome to join as we discuss The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. You're welcome to head to NashvilleParthenon.com to sign up. And a special announcement, you can save the date for an in-person talk here at the Parthenon on January 21st. More details to come on that. Last month was Tennessee Archaeology Month. This month, we are going international. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple things. Today's virtual symposium will last approximately 1 hour. It will include a presentation with a shared screen and time for questions at the end. You are welcome to use the Q&A button for questions that we will discuss at the end, or you can use the chat function for comments, questions, technical difficulties. We have a team behind the scenes who can help out. And I will just confirm, yes, we have enabled closed captioning, so you should be able to show or hide captions on your screen. On behalf of Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation, we'd like to thank Centennial Park Conservancy for supporting 100% of our exhibition and educational programming. Without Centennial Park Conservancy, today's program and our entire suite of International Archaeology Day programming would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the Archaeological Institute of America, Nashville Society, and the AIA for awarding today's talk the Robert L. Scranton Lectureship for a local society lecture. The Robert L. Scranton Lectureship was established in 1999 by the Friends of Robert Scranton. He was born in Ohio and graduated from Mount Union College in 1932, receiving his MA and Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. He was a fellow at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens in the 1930s and 40s, and he's known for his major work on Greek walls. He helped excavate the fortifications on the Athenian Pnyx and worked in the field at Corinth, Kurion, Kenkrei, as well as Athens. And he taught at Illinois College, Vassar, Emory University, and the University of Chicago. Every year, Scranton lectures are given to talks dedicated to classical archaeology, reflecting his teaching and publications. So it's very fitting that today we are talking new research on ancient Greece. Dr. Debby Sneed is an assistant professor of classics at California State University, Long Beach, and an archaeologist whose research focuses on disability in ancient Greece. She is also field director of the Agora Excavations in Athens, conducted by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, which is the preeminent research center for U.S. scholars and students studying Greek culture from antiquity to the present. She earned a Ph.D. in archaeology from UCLA and an MA in classics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Debby, we are excited to hear your talk this morning. Please proceed when you're ready.
Okay. I want to start off by thanking Helen Sanders, the Director of Education for the Nashville Parthenon, for the invitation to speak with you all today, as well as Katie Petroli, the Assistant Director of the Nashville Parthenon, who I've been friends with since about 2010. I'm an archaeologist, and for the most part, for most of my research, I look at the topic of physical disability in ancient Greece. I look at it pretty broadly, but today I'm going to give you a narrow example and show you the things that we can learn from it and apply to all of our considerations of the material from the ancient world. Because we are at the Nashville Parthenon, I want to start with the site of the original Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens. In the work that I do, I look at where disabled people are in ancient Greece and what they're doing. I want to show that disabled people are not just present, but that they're doing things. They are participating members of their societies, just like everyone else. Sometimes they do things a little differently or are limited in their ability to do certain things, but they weren't just hidden away or exiled or killed. In my first article, I looked at ramps in ancient Greece and showed that many of the ramps from ancient Greece were built with disability access in mind. There was a very famous ramp in ancient Greece that provided access to the Athenian Acropolis, at least by the 5th century BCE. This ramp was the focus of an exciting exhibit curated by David Gisson, Jen Steger, and Manthas Armakupi called The Archaeology of Disability. As part of their project and some of David Gisson's other work, they emphasize that the stairs that provide the difficult climb to the top of the Acropolis today, it's not an authentic ancient Greek experience. Until the Roman period, a ramp was how people accessed the summit of the Acropolis. This ramp was more than 150 feet long and more than 30 feet wide. This substantial ramp supported the large crowds, the carts, and the animals that made their way to the top of the Acropolis all the time, but especially during the Pan-Athenaic festival, which was celebrated in Athens every 4 years. Some of the sculpted decoration on the Parthenon probably shows a kind of idealized version of the Pan-Athenaic procession. That's that parade of Athenians during the festival as they made their way to the top of the Acropolis. In this decorative frieze, we see a wide variety of people. And in reality, the procession was intended to include all of the Athenians. That's what Panathenaia means. That would have included plenty of people who had their mobility impaired for a variety of reasons, including people who were very young or very old, including some of Athens's most esteemed citizens. This included pregnant women, as well as people carrying children or large items like baskets or musical instruments. The ramp would have facilitated access for sacrificial animals, as well as for builders and architects lugging materials up to the summit. The even footing and the consistent slope of a ramp would have benefited people for a variety of reasons, something we understand in the context of what we call universal design. Now, the most prominent example of disability within the Parthenon frieze is the figure of Hephaestus, the brother of the goddess Athena, who was born with a physical disability that caused him to walk with a limp. At the culmination of the Ionic frieze of the Parthenon, you can see that famous peplos scene there on the left. Hephaestus and Athena sit together, and they appear to be in conversation. Tucked up under Hephaestus's armpit, we can see a crutch, which would have been much more visible when the paint survived. But we can guess that there were actually plenty of real disabled people who showed up on the Acropolis. There's this anecdote in the Roman period travel writer Pausanias about the entrance to the Acropolis, what would have been at the top of the ramp before the stairs were installed. Pausanias says that at the top of the climb up the Acropolis, there is a stone, not big, but just enough for a small man to sit upon. Upon it, they say, when Dionysus came to the land, Silenus rested. For the older of the satyrs, they call Silenoi. So in the ancient period, you ascended the Acropolis by means of a ramp. There may have been seating along the way if you needed a rest. But what about when you got to the top? Now, the rock of the Acropolis is a mass of schist, sandstone, marl, and conglomerate, capped by a thick layer of hard and highly fractured limestone. The rock itself slopes significantly from its ridge at the center down to the south. In this image, the green part is that limestone cap. Now, in the modern period, the Acropolis has largely been excavated down to this limestone cap, and the exposed portions of the stone have been polished heavily by the feet of the more than 1.5 million people who visit the site each year. But just like how the staircase approach was not an authentic ancient Greek experience, neither is this modern surface. In the ancient period, the top of the Acropolis was modified to regularize its form, and a long and complex series of retaining walls and artificial terraces, as well as stone platforms for buildings, gave the Acropolis a generally flat-topped appearance. You can see in this drawing just how much classical fill must have been added to level the space. And you can see from this diagram just how deep that fill must have been in places. This photograph from about 1880 shows some of the earth that was discarded from the summit. You can see it there in piles coming down from the Acropolis. That's a lot of fill that was removed in the creation of the modern site of the Acropolis. But if we can conceptually return that fill in our minds, we realize that not only was the approach to the Acropolis smooth and regular, but so is its surface. The Acropolis then was originally pretty accessible, which fits with our understanding of the site as specifically intended to be open to and accommodate the entire Athenian populace. Now, this is not hypothetical. Even when we don't know their names, we know that people accessed the Acropolis with a variety of bodies, including a large number of people who were disabled by age, as well as disabled in other ways. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on one piece of evidence that suggests not only the existence of a disabled person on the Acropolis, but their inclusion within that sacred space. I'm going to be focused on the archaic period of Greek history. That's from about 700 to 480 BCE. But really, I'm going to talk about one statue that's dated to about 510 BCE. That's around the time that Athens ejected their tyrant Hippias and established the democracy. Now, you might be familiar with kuroi and korai. These are statues of male and female figures that are dated to the archaic period. These statues were set up in cemeteries as grave markers, but they were also set up in religious sanctuaries where they were dedicated to a god or a goddess as part of a kind of ritual exchange. On the Athenian Acropolis, which was dedicated to the goddess Athena, more than 70 korai, that's those statues of young women, have been found, along with more than 300 inscribed bases, many of which held korai. Now, usually we talk about these korai as a group, as a kind of homogenized collection of beautiful maidens. But I'm going to focus on one of these. This is Acropolis Korai 683, sometimes called the Red Slippers Korai. This is an under life-size statue carved from a single block of marble. It's dated stylistically to 510 BCE. The statue was part of a double dedication, and I'll return to the second figure and the inscribed base a little bit later in the talk. This korai stands facing forward with her right foot advanced. Her hair, which is capped by a diadem, is thick and intricately textured. She has a fringe of cut hair that frames her face. The crinkly chiton that she wears, that's that garment. It's folded over at the waist to form a low kolpos or a pouch. The sleeves of her chiton stretch nearly to her wrists. A smooth ribbon or a band traces both of her arms and her neckline. This ribbon is decorated with a lotus and palmette design and small alternating triangles. On her feet, she wears closed-toed shoes that are pointed and upturned at the top of the toe. In her left arm, which is bent up by her side, she holds a pigeon whose head is missing, while her right hand, which is slightly raised, holds up a piece of her chiton. Red paint remains vibrant on her shoes, her hair, her lips, and portions of her chiton. Her eyebrows, the rims of her eyelids, and her pupils are painted black, while the irises of her eyes are painted yellow. On the museum website, this korai is described as having peculiar proportions, with a disproportionately large head, short legs, and long arms. Now, scholars have attempted to explain some of her physical features in a variety of ways, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the talk, but I argue that this is just a typical ancient Greek representation of a dwarf. In the modern period, we distinguish between more than 200 different genetic conditions that cause skeletal dysplasia and result in short stature. When scholars of the ancient world describe images of dwarfs, they usually try to identify the specific type of dwarf dwarfism represented according to modern diagnostic criteria. But this approach is anachronistic. Ancient Greeks didn't distinguish between all of these different types of dwarfism in their writings or in their art. Rather than attempting to distinguish between types of dwarfism, Greek artists conveyed dwarfism through a variety of features that could include things like short stature relative to other figures in a scene or a group, a disproportionately large head, short or long limbs, a short or a long torso relative to their total height, and a swayed back. Now, these features, they don't all have to appear, but they can appear in any combination to communicate the idea of dwarfism. Now, in this statue, we can identify several hallmarks of ancient Greek depictions of dwarfism. These features would have been especially clear to viewers who saw her set up in her original context, alongside dozens of other chorai who exhibited more typical proportions. Probably the most striking feature of the statue is the size of her head. In this slide, I've adjusted the size of the statues. They're not to scale. It's just to pretend that they're all the same height so that you can see how the proportions line up with two other complete or nearly complete statues. 683's head is just under 1/5 of her total height, while most other chorai, regardless of scale, have heads that are about 1/6 or less of their total height. So her head is relatively larger compared to the total height of the statue. Overall, in the statue, there is an emphasis on roundness, on projection, and disproportionality in the body. While most chorai are relatively balanced top and bottom, the torso of this choré is actually shorter than her legs. You can see that from the back, but her garment with that low-hanging pouch at the front makes it appear that the opposite is true, right? The point here is that there is an impression of disproportionality. Her breasts are prominent and heavily rounded, as are her shoulders and her upper back. The profile of this choré differs significantly from that of other statues. You can see that especially in the shoulders, in the back, in the buttocks, and in the breasts. The scale here, again, is totally off. It's just to show the difference in the profiles. Evelyn Harrison was particularly struck by the abrupt way that the buttocks project from the small of the back. You can see also how her buttocks sit higher on her body than they do for other chorai beneath this deeply swayed back, making the projection even more prominent. The roundness of her body is obvious also in her facial features. She has protruding eyes, full rounded cheeks, and a prominent cleft chin. Her hair swells around her face, adding to the sense of roundness. A scholar named Eleanor Graunik wanted to see if chorai were designed according to a canon of proportions, something that's been proposed for statues of male figures. She used statistical modeling to compare the proportions of 26 chorai with each other, as well as with modern living women. The study has some issues, as you can imagine, but what's relevant is that Graunik was able to show that 683 was an outlier in terms of her proportions. Her body compared in only 5% of the cases with modern women, while other chorai were much more close in terms of bodily proportions, not only to modern women, but also to each other. Graunik noted the chorai's unusually wide hips and large head compared with the other chorai. Now, one thing that's important to note is that the features of this sculpture that are outliers, right, compared to the others, are not the result of inattention or a low level of skill by the sculptor. In fact, the sculptor seems to have paid much more attention to what we call realistic features of the human body than what we see reflected in other statues. Her ears and her eyes are much more detailed than those of other chorai. Her nose is prominent, as is her philtrum. That's that concavity between your upper lip and your septum. Her labiomental fold, that's the curve between your bottom lip and your chin, it's deep, as is the cleft in her very strong chin. She has dimples in both of her cheeks, and her cheekbones and her collarbones can be seen and even felt, as if they're just there beneath the skin. The physicality of this statue extends to her right hand. You can see details of tendons, even a vein that winds its way around the ulnar styloid process on her wrist. That's that bump on the outside of your wrist. Ernst Langlotz acknowledged that this sculpture, 683, represents a much more physical stage in sculpture, one in which all parts of the body are more articulated and dominate the overall impression. Now, other chori have features that are generalized, abstracted, and patterned, but 683's features are closer to the realities of a human body, suggesting intentional attention paid to the particularities of a particular body. And notice that nothing is hidden. Her hair doesn't screen her collarbones. No bracelets conceal her wrists. Her clothing not only doesn't hide her body, but it actually emphasizes it. That low kolbos, that pouch, that overfold in her garment, it's visible all the way around the body. But on the sides and the front, it hangs longer to accentuate the apparent disproportion between her torso and her legs. While at the back, it's pulled up over the buttocks to add bulk to the top of her buttocks, which contributes to the impression of its thickness while also making sure that everything is on full display. The point here is that the sculptor has emphasized all of these features. In addition to the level of detail in the shaping of the body, the painting was also very fine and detailed. You can see a decorative lotus and palmette design running along a ribbon that covers the seam of her garment. We can see the remnants of paint that the whole thing, from the remnants of paint, that the whole thing was brightly painted. So with the high quality of marble, the exacting work of the artist or artists, the detailed paint and polish work, this was a lavish, expensive dedication. Adding to the richness of the representation is her costume, which is very different from that worn by most other chori. Her costume communicates that the maiden, or at least her family, had access to additional wealth beyond this dedication in the form of luxury imports. Now, these shoes, they've got a really distinctive pointed and upturned toe. Here you can see the details. You might be able to see a kind of scalloped collar or top line of the shoe, which sits just below her ankle. The chiton on the outside of her right leg is actually hemmed up to reveal this detail, which is both incised and painted. Early scholars mentioned that her shoes also had blue laces and blue outsoles, but that paint does not survive. Now, closed-toed shoes are very rare among these statues, and the choice to include such distinctive and highly visible bright red footwear is significant. This style of footwear may have originated in Anatolia, which is in modern Turkey, but the Anatolian version is a boot style. It goes up the calf, and it's worn almost exclusively by men. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, though, the style was imported to Etruria, which is a region in central Italy, where the style expanded to include both boots and shoes, and also became associated with both male and female figures. On this famous sarcophagus of the sphinxes, sarcophagus of the spouses, you can see that the female figure is wearing the boot form of this shoe. In this tomb painting from Tarquinia, we get closer to the shoe form. Now, the fact that 683 is a female figure and she's wearing the shoe form of this red pointed toe footwear suggests that the style came not from Anatolia, but from Etruria. The Etruscan reference here is supported also by the type of chiton that she wears. Now, the Greek chiton of the Archaic period was constructed by forming a wide cylinder of fabric, which was then flattened and then buttoned along the top edge, leaving space at the center and at either side for the head and the arms. This method resulted in sleeves with a line of distinctive gaps between the buttons, which allowed the skin of the arm to show through. The majority of Greek sculptural and painted depictions of chitons show these buttoned sleeves with those gaps along the sleeves, as you can see here. The Etruscan style, however, is sewn along the sleeves, not buttoned. You can see that here on this late 6th century BCE Etruscan figurine. She's roughly contemporary with our statue. She wears the same style of chiton. Here it's overlaid with a himation, and you can see the stitch marks along the seam. In some tomb paintings, a decorative ribbon overlays that seam. This figurine is also wearing pointed footwear, here in the boot style. So the chiton that 683 wears is not Greek, but Etruscan, and it's sewn with an embroidered ribbon overlaying the seam. Her shoes are similarly foreign, and they point to Etruria. So this seems to be a conspicuous attempt by the dedicator to communicate access to luxury imports from abroad, in this case from Etruria, which was in the late 6th century, very wealthy and influential in the Mediterranean. With the details of her body and her clothes, we can make a strong argument here for intentionality in the individualized features of the statue. But we can say even more about it than that she represented a dwarf and that her costume communicated access to luxury imports from Etruria. Now, Anthony Raubacek connected this core with an inscribed base that reads, Lysias dedicated this to Athena as a first fruits. Euarchus dedicated this as a tithe to Athena. So here we have a joint dedication, but one in which each person has their own verb of dedication. They each make a dedication, meaning that they made their own dedications, but part of a single dedicatory event. This explains why the base has cuttings for two sculptures, one for each dedication. We have only a fragment of the second figure that was placed on this base. We can't say too much about it except that it's a female figure and appears to be wearing the same style of shoe when they're closed-toed and pointed at the toe. So Lysias and Euarchus, the people who made this dedication, are a man and a woman. They made a joint dedication, and based on what else we see from joint dedications on the Acropolis at this time, we can assume that this is a married couple, and each one made a dedication. And given comparisons with other dedications at this time, we can also assume, I think, that they made the dedication on behalf of their family. In this case, probably their two daughters. Now, nearly every aspect of this proposed reconstruction is otherwise attested on the Acropolis in the Archaic period. The possibility of a married couple dedicating together, okay, a dedication by a woman, okay, and a parent or parents dedicating statues on behalf of their children. It's rare, but other Korai do wear closed-toed shoes. The only unattested element here is the dwarfism, and this is not rendered impossible or even unlikely by any available evidence from the Acropolis or elsewhere. In fact, there may have been a tradition that the size and proportions of a statue didn't have to, but could bear some relationship to the body of the person who made the dedication. This argument that 683 represents a dwarf is bolstered, I think, by the difficulties that scholars have had trying to fit her into the traditional narrative of human representation in Greek art. Now, Acropolis Core 683 was found on the Acropolis in 1882. That was before there was any major interest in this type of statue, and at a time where there just weren't that many others available for comparison. In the first publication, in which she's mentioned in 1883, K.D. Milonas suggested that she represented Aphrodite because of the pigeon she holds in her arm. But as more of these statues were found and published, art historians began to notice how 683 was different from all of the other ones. People pointed out her shoes, because most other Korai wear sandals. They remarked about her lack of jewelry and about how her hair doesn't fall in braids down the front of her shoulders. One early scholar said that she's really more strange than beautiful, and attributed her odd appearance to middling talent by the sculptor. Someone called her a disarming little creature that was created by a sculptor who, whatever his other successes may have been, was not at home in making Korai. Scholars began to try to label her in different ways. One scholar said that she had an African air about her. Another said that her naturalistic appearance resembles a negress. Some scholars looked to see if there was actually darker pigment added to the surface of her face. Another identified her as a maidservant, citing her dark complexion and dwarfish figure. Now, for some scholars, she just generally lacked elegance and delicacy of workmanship. One scholar suggested that the dominant note in the sculpture is awkwardness combined with mediocrity, saying she's ill at ease in her chiton and as embarrassed by the bird in her left hand as by the folds of clothing in her right. Yet another scholar said that her appearance suggested that the sculptor had a definite type in mind, one of those fast maturing girls of Southern stock who develop adult forms before they have grown to full height. Now, this is not just my critique in 2025 of past scholarship, because already in the 1930s, Christos Carouzos was calling for her rehabilitation. He said that it was unfortunate that this sculpture was found where and when it was. At a time, he said, when archaeological criticism, in its impressionistic arrogance, ignored objectivity and concerned itself only with what suited its own taste. Nevertheless, even he offered excuses for her appearance, suggesting that she was the work of a Peloponnesian artist who was trained to produce bronzes and whose skill just didn't transfer well to the medium of stone. Now, more recently, scholars have tended to be less explicitly negative about her appearance, but we still get some unusual evaluations. In 2004, one scholar referred to the lack of grace in her demeanor and said that her bulky shoes hide her feet, as if to warn the viewer that they are insufficiently attractive to permit exposure. This same scholar suggested that this could, in fact, be a representation of a dwarf, but if it is, then she represents a rare moment of humor or sympathy amid the clamor of loftier visual and verbal messages for the ancient visitor to the Acropolis. Now, it should be clear from all of this that this statue has presented a significant challenge to archaeologists and art historians beginning shortly after her discovery. Is she Aphrodite? Is she African? Is she Peloponnesian? Is she of Southern stock? Is she a dwarf person? Is she a joke? Right? Was she created by a skilled craftsperson or a clumsy one? As Caruso said, it is unfortunate that she was found when she was, right? A coincidence that led to her comparison against a standard of beauty that was itself based on a very specific understanding of things like classical beauty and the ancient Greek ideal that came from an art historian in the 1700s. Now, in the 18th century, Johann Winckelmann systematized the study of ancient art by breaking it down into periods that represented its rise, peak, and decline. Winckelmann connected the flourishing of ancient art with a notion of freedom, which he situated in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE in Greece, which he then further broke down into the high and beautiful periods. Within this new kind of historicizing paradigm, we get the notion of an ideal in Greek art, and Winckelmann pointed to this statue, known as the Apollo Belvedere, as the highest ideal of art from antiquity that has survived. This notion of the ideal beauty in ancient art has persisted in both scholarship and in more public fora. One of my personal favorite engagements with the notion of the ideal is Eugen Sandow, considered the founder of modern bodybuilding. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Sandow would visit museums and he would study ancient Greek and Roman sculptures that were on display, and he developed exercises that would sculpt his body to match the bodies of the statues that he saw. As you can see, he was particularly taken with the figure of Hercules. Now, around 1919 or so, he wrote a book called Life is Movement, the physical reconstruction and regeneration of the people, parentheses, a diseaseless world. It included just some truly amazing photographs, as you can see, of Sandow in a variety of classical poses. Now, you can see how quickly Winckelmann's ideal got wrapped up into notions of physical perfection, but also eugenics with that reference to a diseaseless world. The tradition of associating ancient art with a concept of the ideal, it remains current. There's this exhibit at the Museum of Cycladic Art in Athens in 2021 and 2022 called Kolos, the Ultimate Beauty. This exhibit put on display the idea that beauty in the ancient world was not just about physical appearance, but that a physically perfect body reflected also a kind of moral perfection, right? Still, it is a definition of perfection. As we can see, the persistence of the ideal in scholarship continues, right? So consider our Kore. By itself, this statue is one of our most complete from the Acropolis. It preserves excellent evidence for paint. That in and of itself is significant, and yet she's almost entirely absent from handbooks of ancient Greek sculpture. Going further, we have not just this statue, but also the complete inscription and a fragment of the second figure. And all of them were found in the general place where they were dedicated. This is the single best evidenced dedication from the archaic Acropolis. It presents us with a rare opportunity to take a fully contextual approach to a single dedicatory event. As is frequently emphasized, statues were intended in the ancient period to be understood with their inscriptions, not divorced from them. And here we can do just that. We have the complete painted statue, a complete inscription that tells us the motivations for the dedication, both a tithe and a first fruits. We have a dedication by both a man and a woman at this pivotal time in Athenian history with the establishment of the democracy. Why is this dedication not more prominent in our discussions of dedicatory practice? The fact of the matter is, this sculpture just doesn't fit into our preconceived notions of beauty. And so it raises questions that are not answerable within the context of traditional approaches to Greek sculpture. But if we can separate, right, if we can separate our interpretation of Acropolis Kore 683 from a definition of the Greek ideal that was invented in the 18th century and is true only with the erasure of this sculpture, if we can see this sculpture through new frameworks of meaning, then the problems that this Kore has presented to scholars are easily resolved. Now, according to my proposed reconstruction, a married couple named Lysias and Euarchus each dedicated a statue to Athena on the Acropolis at the end of the 6th century BCE. The statues were probably intended as representations, as kind of stand-ins for the couple's daughters who are not named in the inscription. One statue, 683, was intentionally carved with features that are most often associated with dwarfism, presumably because one of the couple's daughters had dwarfism. She was depicted in a costume, including that Etruscan-style chiton and those pointed red shoes that boasted of the family's access to luxury imports and so to their wealth and status. Now, even if we accept the first part of this argument that the statue represents a dwarf maiden, there are still a few important issues that remain, including whether or not a representation or a depiction of a living individual, something like what we would call a portrait, could have been made and dedicated this early in the history of Greek art. Now, in the modern period, a portrait usually refers to an image that bears an exact, even a photorealistic physiognomic likeness to its subject. Now, it's important right away to relieve ourselves of this definition. As Sheila Dillon has argued, ancient Greek artists were largely indifferent to physiognomic likeness. Kathy Kiesling has said that in both archaic and classical Greek portraiture, replicating the body of an individual portrait subject was seldom synonymous with creating a realistic individualized portrait likeness. These are separate things. Ancient Greek portraits, even when we know for sure who the person is who's being represented in the portrait, ancient Greek portraits could have features that are individualized and realistic at the same time as having features that are generic, okay? So at this time in Greek art, portraits served to express a person's place within a larger framework based on things like gender, age, and social status. So a portrait is not exactly the things that we think about with a portrait. Now at this time, in the 6th century BCE on the Acropolis, inscriptions for statues tell us who dedicated a statue, sometimes who made a statue, sometimes on whose behalf a dedication was made, but never who a statue represents. We do have some cases where we might have portraits. In one case, not shown here, We have a statue of a musician that was dedicated by a musician. So we think that this is a portrait of the person who made the dedication. Another possible portrait is this relief on the screen, what we call the Acropolis Potter relief, which was dedicated around the same time as our statue. The relief shows a man seated on a stool. And if you can see, in his left hand, he's holding two drinking cups. The inscription tells us that a man dedicated a tithe to Athena. This has been interpreted as a dedication by a potter who has depicted himself holding the products of his workshop that represent the profits from which that tithe was drawn. Now, these few examples notwithstanding, the overall impression is that Greeks in the 6th and even the 5th centuries BCE only rarely dedicated freestanding statues representing themselves in sanctuaries. But what about Greeks depicting statues, dedicating statues that depicted other people, right? Kathy Kiesling has said that it would be surprising if there were no portraits dedicated on the Acropolis. We just have so many statues. In addition to the likely contenders, things like the famous Moschophoros, we have at least 3 statues of scribes that are likely portraits. Let's look at this one, which was dedicated around the same time as our statue. It shows a male figure seated on a tall stool. He leans forward, kind of poring over documents that he once held in his hand. Now, some scholars have connected this statue with an inscription on a column that says that Alkimikos dedicated a statue to Athena in honor of his father, Cheiron. Now, Cheiron, the father of the person who dedicated the statue, probably himself dedicated an altar on the Acropolis about 50 years earlier to commemorate his service as a treasurer to Athena. So the suggestion here is that Cheiron was a treasurer to Athena, and then sometime later, his son Alkimikos dedicated a statue of him in his performance of his duties to Athena. In fact, statues of figures that are performing specific roles like scribes, but also horsemen and other figures, are the likeliest candidates for portraits on the Acropolis because of the specificity of that representation. So what can we say? We can say that some late 6th century BCE dedications at religious sanctuaries in general, but on the Acropolis in particular, may have been portraits. We know from these examples, but also from other evidence, that portraits did not require a name label to be understood as portraits, right? It doesn't have to say, this is a statue of my dad. Okay, there's a lot of debate about the Acropolis chori, about if they represent the dedicators, if they represent Athena, if they represent living women, or what. The fact of the matter is, from the Acropolis, we have more than 70 statues of maidens, more than 70 chori, and more than 300 inscribed stone bases, many of which also held chori. Very few of the chori can be connected with a base that bears an inscription, meaning that in most cases, we have at best only half of the original dedication, but often less given the fragmentary nature of many of the statues and inscribed bases. We have to understand that there was no template. There's no rule for dedication in the Archaic period, or really at any time. So every time we have an unambiguous attestation of a dedicatory practice or a dedicatory situation, that introduces that possibility for interpretation for other more ambiguous examples. In the case of our chore, nothing that I've suggested is ruled out. And in fact, each aspect of my reconstruction is more likely than any of the alternatives. And no aspect of it is controversial in art historical scholarship if you remove the question of dwarfism. So what is a chore anyway? A chore dedicated in an ancient Greek religious sanctuary was an agalma. That's an object endowed with the quality of being pleasing or capable of eliciting pleasure from the god or goddess to whom it was dedicated. Regardless of whom the chori represented, they were dedicated in an attempt to delight Athena as part of a ritual exchange and simultaneously to express the family's performance of their wealth and status, and even maybe a kind of elite maidenhood. Now, some people might be skeptical still that a statue that was intended to delight Athena would not erase disability. Disability is often read as specific and ideologically loaded. The presence of disability must mean something, whereas non-disabled traits, like those seen on other cori, they're allowed to be generic and neutral and passive. As Rosemary Garland Thompson has explained, by its very presence, the exceptional body seems to compel explanation. We resist representations of disability in ancient art until we know what made it allowable. Now, this statue was set up in a solemn religious context, a religious sanctuary. But dwarfism is considered only allowable in the realm of comedy or parody. This is why, for example, one scholar finds it possible that the core represents a dwarf, but if it does, she says it was a joke. In the book on the origins of visual humor in Greek vase painting, Alexander Mitchell suggests or he argues that dwarfs lent their distinctive traits to the genre of caricature to amuse the greater public and reaffirm the canon, almost pay homage to the ruling imagery. But this view is circular, okay? So dwarfs only exist in the realm of comedy or parody, and so are only identified in contexts that are obviously comic or parodic, or if we identify a dwarf, then the scene that they're in must be identified as comic or parodic, okay, regardless of any other elements. You can see an example here. This is a scene on the so-called Francois vase. It dates to about 50 years before our statue. This vase is full of painted scenes that show heroic images, mostly drawn from the epic poems of Homer. At the foot of the vase is a scene of the Geranomachy, a mythical battle between pygmies and cranes. This battle opens up Book 3 of Homer's Iliad. It says, "Now, when the men of both sides," that's the Trojans and the Greeks, "were set in order by the leaders, the Trojans came on with a clamor and shouting like wildfowl, as when the clamor of cranes goes high to the heavens, when the cranes escape the wintertime and the rains unceasing, and clamorously wing their way to the streaming ocean, bringing to the Pygmaean men bloodshed and destruction. At daybreak, they bring on the baleful battle against them." There are no obvious elements of comedy in this scene from Homer's Iliad, right? It's not really a comic text. There also are no scenes of comedy anywhere on this vase, but this scene of the Geranomachy on the Francois vase is read as a form of comic relief simply because of the presence of dwarfs. Extraordinary bodies are hypervisible. But as Rosemary Garland Thompson has said, the cultural resonances accorded to those extraordinary bodies arise from the historical or intellectual moments in which those bodies are embedded. To put it as Robert Bogdan does, how we view people who are different has less to do with what they are physiologically than who they are culturally. For the last few centuries, dwarfs have been sought after for purposes of entertainment. Dwarfism has been construed as humorous. This has led to the assumption that there is something inherently funny about dwarfism, and that dwarfism can never be anything else. But as Aaron Pritchard has pointed out, societies have not always laughed at dwarfs. Like so much else about human behavior, what's funny is culturally specific. Nevertheless, in ancient Mediterranean studies, dwarfs and other people with extraordinary bodies have undergone a process similar to what David Hevy calls infrequent. This is when bodily eccentricities are foregrounded, they become the only thing that you see, and also collapsed, such that all physical differences constitute a freakery, right? This amorphous category of corporeal otherness. We assume that everyone with extraordinary bodies in ancient Greek art and literature were not only firmly outside of the ideal, but that they were always already infreaked. Without a critically informed framework of meaning, we constrain the narrative to one where this representation of a dwarf core dedicated in a religious context is impossible. We cannot see a dwarf person here on the Acropolis in the late 6th century BCE because we assume that dwarfism is not and was never beautiful. But this is a Greek ideal that was invented in the 18th century, an ideal that was created when few pieces of ancient sculpture were available for autopsy, an ideal that should have been revised as more evidence came to light through excavations. Instead of reconciling the seeming conflict by reconsidering ancient Greek concepts of beauty or reverence, or however else we want to read these chori, we just leave this entire dedication out of our narratives, despite the sheer amount of information that we can glean from it about dedicatory practices, sculptural representation, notions of the body and identity, trade and interactions with the Etruscans, wealth and display, citizenship and belonging and disability in ancient Greece. The fact of the matter is, whatever else the chori represent, they were intended to delight the goddess. We must assume that those that were set up were successful in this goal. This means then that this statue of a dwarf maiden delighted Athena and should delight us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I have a whole list of questions, but I will first invite the audience. If you have questions for Dr. Sneed, please feel free to use the Q&A box, or you can also use the chat box, and I will begin asking some of our questions to our speaker. First off, Debbie, we're getting lots of comments expressing thanks and gratitude for your talk. So I would like to add to those as well. Thank you for sharing, one of your research on this ancient statue with us. One of the first questions talks about, is there evidence to believe that the statue represented a prominent person or a priestess? So we talked a little bit about the family bringing exports in, but I think this question is related to the individual.
Yeah, it's a great question. We can't say. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not the chori could represent priestesses. I think our only evidence that a statue of a priestess was dedicated comes from like the 4th century. So we can't say. The question about whether she represents a prominent individual, we have a lot of questions about sort of who was allowed or enabled to make dedications on the Acropolis. And things get a little bit complicated at the late 6th century when we have the institution of the democracy in place. We think that there was a kind of broadening of the possibilities of who could dedicate. What we can say is that the family must have been wealthy, right? So a marble statue dedication, especially with this level of detail, was very expensive. There are options for less expensive dedications. And so the marble and even bronze statues were among the more expensive types of dedication. So we can say that they were wealthy and probably elite, right? We can say that they had some sort of, we can't say they're likely Greek, right? But they might have some sort of a connection to the Etrurians or to the Etruscans, right? So are they traders? We can't really say, that's all speculation, but we can say that they were wealthy and elite. And that's the extent of how confident we can be about that interpretation.
Thank you. Okay, here's our next question. I was wondering if you could say more about the ways that race and disability intersect in ways that scholars have made their analysis of objects that are not considered kind of the normal. So what does it say, for example, that a representation of a disabled person might be viewed as an example of bad craftsmanship or Africanness?
Yeah, what you see in all of those quotes is an attempt to try to define, right? So art historians generally have found this sculpture ugly. Like, we can say that, is that they do not find this one as beautiful as the other ones. And so what you see in all of those quotes is what at the time of scholarship, right, that they were writing was considered ugly, right? So they were like, okay, so it's not beautiful. And so these aren't necessarily identifications as of the things, like they're attempting to identify them as different things, but it communicates what that scholar, and probably it has more to do with the time period than with an individual, right? But what was considered ugly in the context of Greek art at that time, right? These are all just kind of flailing attempts to try to explain this sculpture away. And so when you see that shift from race to disability, right, as a joke, you see a shift in those scholarly trends about how we talk about race, right? So when those sort of race-related ones are kind of early 20th to mid 20th century, and you can see then that we had a shift in how people talk about race after that, because now race no longer becomes an acceptable way to explain this away. And now people are shifting to something else. They're like, okay, was the person just bad at sculpting? Or is it a disabled person and this is a joke, right? So it actually just shows a shift in this is an intellectual history question. And it just shows a shift in that perspective of what's going on in art historical scholarship.
And as you mentioned, it's also really interesting to think about the more modern lens reading an ancient sculpture. The next question is um, from a professor who studies sport for people with disabilities in sport. Are there any depictions of people with disabilities participating in sport or physical activity like we see of able-bodied people?
It's a great question. Not exactly. So sport is complicated. And no, we don't see images of disabled people participating in sport. However, sport was considered to be kind of preparatory and good training for being in the military. And so a lot of times people would practice in the gymnasium, they would practice sport, they would practice with hunting in order to be good in the military. That's kind of like conceptually what's going on. And we do see plenty of disabled people in the military, right, which suggests that they're going through those same processes. If we accept that people who were successful in the military were successful in sport, then we have to assume that we've got people like a king of Sparta in the 4th century BCE, Agesilaus II, who was physically disabled from birth or early childhood. He must have gone through the Spartan sort of education system, the Agora, which included sport. And so if we accept that role of sport as preparatory for military service, and then we see disabled people in military, they must have participated in sport.
Kind of a similar question. Did you find many other examples of disability during your research or primarily the ones shown in your presentation?
It's a great question. There are actually tons of representations of disability in both art and literature. There's, in fact, not a genre of art or literature where disability is not present. One of the things that I hope that comes from this, right, is not that people go around museums and try to identify who's disabled and who's not disabled, right, but that we broaden our understanding of what was considered beautiful, what kind of bodies were present and participating in the ancient world, and so we see disabled people all over the place. Okay. And it's just more about opening our minds to what the realities of ancient life were like, instead of constraining them to kind of old-fashioned narratives of what that life looked like.
The next question is, how tall is the sculpture? And is there anything in available sources that may tell us who she may have been if a physical person in the past?
It's a great question. So this is an under life-size statue, right? So actually probably most of our cori are under life-size, so they weren't intended to be the same physical size. This is probably at 2/3 scale, which is a very popular scale for cori. By herself, she's about 85 centimeters tall. So divide that by 2.54, and that's how many inches it is. And so, yeah, she's about 85 centimeters tall, probably at about a 2/3 scale, which is a popular scale, which, if we accept the 2/3 scale, puts her well within the kind of what we consider to be the height of a lot of people with dwarfism, like within the range.
And we have a question about the root of the name of the statues being Kori. Notably, Kore being an alternative name for Persephone. Are they related in root?
It's a great question. No and yes. So Kore with a capital K is a reference to the goddess Persephone. It's also just a Greek word that means like a unmarried young woman, right? And so lowercase k Kore just means, like, the ancient Greeks did not call these Kori. We call them Kori. And so there's that. But there is a really famous statue of a Kore, lowercase k, called the Phrasiclea Kore. You can look that up. It's like Phrasicleia, Phrasyclea Core, and it's really great. So it's a representation of a young woman, and she's got these unopened lotus buds. So she's holding one in her hand, and she's got a crown of unopened lotus buds. And the inscription that goes with this statue, which was a grave marker, says, "I am forever called Core." Okay, given this name from the gods in place of marriage. So it seems that this young woman died before she got married, right? So this is a very important rite of passage for women in the ancient world, is getting married. So those unopened lotus buds, right? She hasn't blossomed, right? And she's forever called Core. This is a kind of pun, right? So she's forever called a Core, an unmarried woman, but also forever called capital K Core, because now she's married to death, right? She becomes Persephone. And so even though they don't call it this, right, we call them this, but there is this kind of play on that.
Our next question comes in connection to studying and thinking about Greek theater. Have you learned anything about access to the theater for disabled individuals?
It's a great question. I don't know for sure. So I don't know that much about the Greek theater. The place that I would look if I were studying this is there's a really famous theater at a healing sanctuary of Epidaurus, which definitely does have a lot of accessibility features built into it as a sanctuary. And so that's where I would start, is to see if there's anything about that theater that gives us any suggestions. We know, for example, that you could enter from different places. So entering from the bottom, okay, there's some seating there, but that was priority seating. And so would that happen? We don't know for sure. I don't know for sure, but this is definitely like an avenue for exploration. It's a great question.
Thanks, Debbie. We are getting lots of thank you for your presentations in the chat. We have one final question I will ask here. To what extent do we know if dwarfism would be considered a disability in ancient Greece? In this case, we've seen a wealthy young woman with dwarfism potentially could be considered a potential bride. So kind of thinking about if disability is even a category for ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. It's not a category in ancient Greece. So it kind of isn't even really a real thing now, in the sense that disability is not, it doesn't exist outside of a culture, right? So disability comes with whatever the social expectations are about what a body should be able to do, right? So you've got a society, they have expectations about what a body should be able to accomplish, and people who have difficulty accomplishing that become disabled, right? You could think about eyeglasses, right? So we've sort of, before eyeglasses were invented and then became widespread and available and low cost, and now I think something like 60% of adults require corrective lenses, so it's pretty normalized. Before that, right, you couldn't really have an expectation that everyone would have 20/20 vision, because not everyone would. And so eyeglasses, though, in being able to correct that, they did something that Catherine Ott, who's a disability studies scholar who's at the Smithsonian, one of the Smithsonian museums in Washington, D.C., she said that eyeglasses shifted the thresholds of sight. So all of a sudden, that what was potentially a disability, right, becomes not a disability in the same way, right? We don't really consider people who wear eyeglasses to be disabled. And so it's really just about what a culture expects a body to be able to accomplish, and can they do it or not, right? And so that's actually going to shift for people within a society, right? There are going to be different expectations for men and for women, because those bodies are expected to perform differently, right? So if you are a man who's supposed to be out in the fields working or sailing on a ship or something like that, certain disabilities are going to be more relevant for them than for other people, right? Certain disabilities are going to be completely irrelevant, right? So probably tons of people in the ancient world were dyslexic, and it never came up, right? Because they were illiterate. And so they weren't expected to be reading. And so it just was never a thing that created that conflict, right, and arose as a disability. And so really it just has to do with how we understand disability for us, how the Greeks understood disability for them, and then trying to figure out where that sort of what we call maybe a misfit relationship between an environment, which could be physical or social or legal, and the body that enters it, and what happens in those sort of confrontations, those misfit confrontations.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I will just say one more time that we are getting lots of folks expressing their thanks and gratitude for a very thought-provoking talk. Could you remind us when your article in connection to this topic is coming out and where?
Yeah, thank you. I should also mention this project is co-authored with Erin Lawrence Roseman, who just finished her Ph.D. at Berkeley and is on the job market. So hire her. Anyway, so this is coming out in an art historical journal called Art Bulletin in December, I think. Feel free to email me if you would like a copy of it, if you don't have access, sort of after the new year, maybe.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It's been a real treat to hear new research on topics centuries old. So we really appreciate your time today and this weekend to celebrate International Archaeology Day with us. On behalf of Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation, the Parthenon, and the Archaeological Institute of America Nashville Society, thank you to our speaker today and to you all in the audience for joining us to think about life in ancient times, in ancient Greece as a vibrant and colorful place. So thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you at some of our next events with the AIA Nashville Society. Hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.